The Catholic worker movement, first founded in the United States in 1933, believes in social harmony and a personal responsibility for helping the poor. The movement believes in the God-given dignity of every human person. Today, there are over 185 Catholic worker communities worldwide that remain committed to nonviolence, voluntary poverty, prayer, and hospitality for the homeless. Joining me in studio to tell us more about the Catholic worker movement is Rob Shearer, an activist and Catholic worker at Zacchaeus House here in Toronto. Thanks for coming in.
Hey, it's great to be here, Jesse.
Now, why don't we start by talking about the origins of the Catholic movement and perhaps the political and social climate in which it arose?
Yeah, sure. Well, of course, the 30s, we were in the heat of the Depression, and a woman by the name of Dorothy Day, who's fairly well known in the Catholic Church, she'd been this kind of bohemian activist writer type in Greenwich Village, New York. And a whole bunch of things happened in her life. She'd been in some common law relationships, had an abortion, and a bunch of stuff came together, and she ended up converting to Catholicism. But something interesting happened in her. She had this sort of newfound pious faith, but she'd been involved in the suffragette movement. She'd been involved in all of this radical social change that was happening through the 20s and 30s. And she sort of felt this disconnect because she had this new faith, but couldn't match it.
Couldn't reconcile it with her political activities.
Right, right. And so she, one day after covering a labor march for a Catholic publication, ended up in a church and fell to her knees and said, God, these two worlds got to come together in some way. And she actually ended up running into this guy, Peter Morin, he was actually in her apartment when she got back from this march. And he was this mystic philosopher type who said, we're going to start a paper called The Catholic Radical. And we have this program where we're going to create a new society in the shell of the old and create a world where it's easier for people to be good. And it was born. The Catholic worker was born. They started a paper sort of modeled a little bit on the socialist worker. They were originally going to call it the Catholic Radical, but they had a fight about it, so they settled on the Catholic worker. And on May 1st, 1933, which is, of course, both May Day and in the Catholic Church, the feast day of St. Joseph, St. Joseph the Worker, they launched this paper in Union Square. Started out small. Within a few months, it had grown to 150,000 copies each month, and was a penny a copy. It still is to this day. They always say inflation doesn't affect the Catholic worker movement. And basically, one of the things they wrote about in the paper was hospitality, and they were saying it's the responsibility of every person of faith, of every Christian, to take in the homeless. And this is a practice in many faith traditions around the world, but particularly in North American Christianity, it had been lost. So they started writing about this. Within a few months, people were knocking on Dorothy Day's door. She was living with her aunt and uncle at the time. And within a few months' time, they had about 15, 20 people living in their apartment. Her aunt and uncle weren't incredibly so they decided they needed to open something a little bit more formal, and they started the first houses of hospitality. And so you mentioned there's a good number of Catholic worker movements. Most of those communities have a house of hospitality. So I live in one of those houses of hospitality, and that's sort of where the movement came out of. It was trying to get Catholic social teaching into action in many ways and be lived out by people rather than being this abstract philosophy that
sort
just
of
exists.
Reuniting theory and practice.
Right, yeah, right, yeah.
Now, I mean, maybe you could tell us a bit more about, I guess, the growth over those several decades. What were the types of struggles that the Catholic worker movement would be involved in? What were, I mean, I guess the notion of Catholic worker implies a class struggle.
Sure.
But what were the types of movements or catalyzing events that really allowed it to grow to the numbers it has today?
Yeah, well, I think what had happened was in the 30s it exploded of course, with the context that was happening.
The great need and homelessness that occurred at the time.
There were huge soup lines all of a sudden at Catholic workers, which they never wanted. They were always like, we want to be small, we want to be personal. But it grew and grew, and as World War II broke out, the Catholic worker, much like a lot of the historic peace churches, the Mennonites and the Quakers and those folks, the Catholic workers said, we don't participate in war. And the Catholic worker went from, I think, about 30 or 40 houses down to about 4 or 5 because all the houses said, we need to support this war.
Right.
This was a very popular
Right.
war. Dorothy Day said, don't call yourself a Catholic worker.
Yeah.
So the Catholic worker maintained its stance of nonviolence. And that was a big struggle. Throughout the 50s, the Catholic worker, they sort of almost became known as proto-hippies in some ways because they were
sort of practicing the ideals that the hippies later engulfed
Right.
a decade or so
Right,
before.
yeah. And in the 50s, there was all these drills, these war drills with the sirens. You had to go into a bomb shelter as if a nuclear bomb fell, you'd be
Right.
safe in the basement of a church. And the Catholic worker said, we're not going to live in this culture of fear. So they started to have parties in Central Park. And,
Nice. And
were
really
arrested
stand up to the fear and paranoia of the Cold War.
Right, right. And so a lot of people like Thomas Merton and the Berrigan brothers were kind of cutting their teeth, so to speak, in the Catholic worker movement. They were writing for the paper. And the Catholic worker movement post-war continued to grow and flourish to what it is today.
And it sounds like in part by providing a genuine radical leadership for
Right.
Catholics and others to see as an alternative to, let's say the McCarthyism of the 50s
Sure.
or, other excess, the military-industrial complex in the 60s and 70s.
Right, yeah. It was essentially bringing together these groups of mystics and radicals and activists and the pious and the impious and saying, we're going to somehow live differently. We're going to try and live some kind of ideals of faith and hope and love in some way that just somehow gets marginalized in mainstream society. So the Catholic worker invoked, the spirit of St. Clare and St. Francis and said, we're going to do something
Right on.
different, yeah, yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we have to break for a commercial, but we'll come back and continue this really fascinating discussion.
Sounds great.
I'm speaking with Toronto Catholic worker Rob Shearer. We'll be back with more on this topic right after the break. You're watching 3D Dialogue. Welcome back to 3D Dialogue. I'm Jesse Hirsh, and I'm in studio today with Rob Shearer, an activist and Catholic worker. Now, before the break, we were talking a bit about the historical origins and sort of, let's say, initial stages of the Catholic worker movement. Why don't we jump to the present and maybe talk a bit more of your own experience and what it's like to live in a Catholic worker house?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've been living in Zacchaeus House for about 5 years, and essentially, we live in what are called houses of hospitality. We have actually about 5 households on our street in the Parkdale neighborhood
Nice.
of Toronto. And 2 of those houses, we take in people who are in transition. They might be homeless people or refugees, newcomers, anybody who needs a space. We don't discriminate.
Yeah.
And we essentially live and work with people. We live a life of, I think, a balanced life, an attempted balanced life of prayer and activism. So we protest war and injustice. When this current war in Iraq broke out, we were there protesting and were arrested at the Downsview military base. We get involved in all sorts of stuff, and the Catholic worker really believes that it's not just charity, but it's charity and justice need to go hand in hand, and that's a statement from a pope.
Absolutely, yeah.
Basically, so we see ourselves as living in that ongoing tradition of Catholic workers. The house in Toronto in the early 90s, when three men who were studying to be priests, 3 gay men actually who were studying to be priests, decided that, or felt that God was calling them to start a Catholic worker house, and they wanted to take a year to pray to do that. And within a few weeks of them getting a house together to pray, somebody came to the door saying, I'm living with AIDS, my church has rejected me, my family's rejected me.
The needs were just so strong, they couldn't take that year. They had to work right away.
Yeah, and Dorothy Day always said, if you want to start a Catholic worker house, just go ahead and do it. Like, there's no centralized structure. We're not an institution. We don't exist on paper. So we have this kind of bundle of houses of families and individual people and workers and non-workers, and it's really a big mess. I wish I could.
But at the same time, I mean, it sounds like there's an inherent egalitarianism, that really you're taking someone who society might be putting down, and you're saying, no, you are amongst equals here.
Right.
And that seems really empowering.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, it's a struggle because there's always power and privilege and all sorts of stuff at play there. So I'd like to say we live the ideals. We don't always do it, but we really struggle to, like I said at the beginning, build a new society in the shell of the old, to create that world where it's easier to be good. And sure, that's the ideal. And each day we struggle towards that. We have open meals. People from all in the neighborhood come and have meals. We just hang out together. We don't. And it's funny. People say to me, "What do you do?" And
live.
I just live. I don't have an answer. I hang out with people. Sometimes I'll go to court with somebody, or I'll do some advocacy work or whatever. But really, the majority of my life is just work and prayer. It's just.
And it sounds like you're living an alternative, which is in itself a type of leadership that people can see, hey, I can do that too.
Right.
It's not that it's inaccessible.
Right. And it's a way of living which in many ways is on the edge. Like we don't get paid for what we do. Most of us live without waged labor. So some workers go out and do work, and that helps us maintain the house because we don't get funding from the state or the church. We reject that kind of funding and say we're going to do this out of our own pocket, at our own personal expense.
Which I assume also gives you a level of autonomy
that
really allows you to engage in whatever activities you feel are required or needed.
We don't need to write budgets. We don't need to do any of that stuff. And in some ways, that's why the Catholic worker gets called an anarchist movement. We don't really participate or cooperate with the state, and we do this because we believe God calls us to do this and to see Christ in every person who comes to the door, and
now,
we do that.
I mean, it's interesting on the one hand that it seems to me a clear level of humility, that you acknowledge that you're trying and you're not perfect. But on the flip side, do you ever encounter hostility from the church or from the state in terms of them seeing yourselves as a threat to the status quo or to their ongoing power, as it were?
Well, it's interesting. The state, the Catholic worker, were recently spied on by the FBI in the U.S. for being this
just for being dissenters,
dissentered kind of group. So for sure, and because we do a lot of direct action, nonviolent direct action, we are seen as a threat by the state, and we have a tense relationship with the church. Dorothy Day always called herself a faithful daughter of the church. She had an interesting quote. The church might be a whore, mother, and we, I think we try and live that tension. Well,
and explicitly, as the church sort of grapples with a changing world, do you guys try to get the church to change?
Sure, let's say, accept? I mean, I mentioned that the Catholic worker was founded by 3 gay men, very devout Catholics, and we, so we have some struggles with where the church stands on certain issues, and yet we are faithful servants of the church in many ways as well. So I think
it's not that you're turning your back on the Catholic community as a whole.
No.
Rather, you've granted yourself some autonomy to show how the Catholic Church could evolve.
Yeah, and we want to live a positive witness within the church and to the church, and at the same time, as Bruce Cockburn says, kick at the darkness till it bleeds daylight. And sometimes there's a hell of a lot of darkness in the church. So.
But I mean, that's a good question. Do you ever feel that the odds are against you, or that there's so much despair and so much tyranny in the world that the uphill battle is almost not worth fighting, or do you find that there's inspiration in just being a community?
There's a lot of hope in community. Like, we've had some rough times in our houses. We never know where the next meal is going to come from, where the next rent check's going to come from. We've had some really intense stuff. We've had a suicide at the house in the last year. We've had some really difficult stuff. And I maintain a sense of hope, a sense of pulling through that stuff, often rooted in the spiritual practice. But yeah, to be honest, many days it's like, how are we going to get through this? How are we going to do this? And that's where, you know, miracles come in a way, and
Yes.
whatever those might be. That's where
What
this
gets you
mystery
going.
keeps
Yeah,
us going.
yeah.
So,
well, I mean, I think certainly, you know, the story of the Catholic worker movement is very inspiring, and hopefully our viewers will be inspired enough to not only recognize and support, but maybe even contemplate starting such a house in their own community.
yeah, we'd love, you know, get a hold of us, and we'd love to talk to you,
Right
or
on.
just do it yourself.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for
Thank
coming
you,
in
Jesse.
today. That was Rob Shearer, a Catholic worker from Zacchaeus House here. Rob is also a festival coordinator for the Canadian Council of Churches. Up next, the practice of languor, or the free food kitchen in the Sikh faith. You're watching 3D Dialogue.